In English, we have several distinct accents that vary in different parts of the world. We have, of course, the New Zealand accent, the Australian accent, the Indian accent, the American accent, the British accent, the South African accent. All of these accents have their own linguistic differences and variations in both vocabulary and the way things are pronounced. Spanish is quite similar in that in different regions of the Spanish-speaking world, there are different accents and methods of pronunciation. For many people learning Spanish, they're not aware of these distinctions, and when they go and speak to a native speaker of Spanish, they're often surprised by the variations in the way that words can be pronounced, as well as the different forms of vocabulary. And for that reason today, I will be addressing the different accents and phonetic variations that occur in the Spanish language in different regions.
¿Qué onda? Soy Sebastián y este podcast es Otomi. For all of my non-Spanish native speakers, this is Sebastian, and I'm a high school student in the Bay Area. I've got the facts and the opinions. Join me as we discuss topics of society, culture, identity, education, and life.
Some people assume that Castilian Spanish is the only language of Spain, but this is absolutely not true. There's Galician Portuguese, there's Catalan, there's Basque. There are different variations, Romance and non-Romance languages that have been spoken in Spain due to the wide variety of kingdoms, and there have always been different ethnic groups within Spain itself. So today we're talking about Castilian Spanish. And Castilian Spanish is the Spanish spoken in Spain, and it's the Spanish spoken in Latin America. Castilian Spanish is the Spanish that you learn here in the United States as well at school, and Castilian Spanish it receives its name from the Kingdom of Castile, which united with the Kingdom of Aragon. When talking about Spanish, I'll be referring to it as Spanish for the rest of this episode. However, I just wanted to preface by clarifying we're talking about Castilian Spanish, not any of the other Spanish languages. Castilian Spanish, one of the largest distinctions between Spanish from Latin America and Spanish from Spain has been always pronunciation. In Spain, it is well known that there is a different phoneme or different phonetic sound that is made that you don't hear in Latin American Spanish. Now, this phenomenon is where the TH sound in English, as in think, which is actually a dental fricative, voiceless dental fricative. Now, these terms are linguistic terms that come directly from the International Phonetic Alphabet, so you don't need to know it. I'll just address this word as theta for the rest of this episode. When I'm talking about theta, I'll be talking about the th sound. The reason it's called theta is because in the International Phonetic Chart of the International Phonetic Alphabet, the phoneme of the th sound in English is given the Greek letter theta symbol. So for that reason, we're going to be calling it theta. And theta occurs in Spain, but not in Latin America. Now, this theta also occurs in other Hispanic countries such as Equatorial Guinea, but we're not going to be going very in-depth about that country. So, although the theta doesn't occur in Latin America, in Spain there are different variations, and I'm going to explicitly show you the different categories of pronunciation. There are 3 categories of pronunciation when it comes to the C, the S, and the Z in Spanish. There's the one that most people are familiar with as being the stereotypical Spanish accent from Spain, is the distinción, which is basically distinction, pronouncing with distinction. In this case, the distinción is the educated standard of Spain. Here, there's a distinction between the pronunciation of the S and the pronunciation of the Z and C before an E and an I. The S is pronounced as an S in English, as a S. However, the C and the Z are pronounced as a voiceless dental fricative, which is the theta. Some words that would give an example. Corazón, which has a Z, has the theta sound, corazón. Bicycle, bicicleta. Plaza, plaza. But then for words with an S, such as house, it would be pronounced casa. Now, this is the educated standard, so it's used when it comes to official matters, business, politics, and it is that standard, and it is used primarily in the northern and eastern area of Spain, where there are other variations of pronunciation occur in the southern and central area of Spain. Now, the next category of pronunciation is the ceseo. The ceseo is primarily in south and central Spain, and it is when the S, the Z, and the C are all pronounced as an S in English. Now, the ceseo is also the standard in all Latin American countries. So, one of the reasons why the ceseo occurs in Latin America is because the majority of the conquistadores who went to Latin America, they were from the southern region of Spain, like Andalusia. So in this case, if we were to repeat the same words we just said with the distinction or distinción, the word that was pronounced as corazón would become corazón. The word bicicleta becomes bicicleta. The word plaza becomes plaza. And of course, the word casa, which has an S, remains as casa. I was never really aware that this occurred in Spain. However, I realized that, maybe they do have the ceseo in Spain, because one of my favorite musical groups, the Gypsy Kings, they were born in France, but their parents were Spanish, Romani people who fled after the Spanish Civil War of the 1930s. When they sing, they're known for having that Andalusian Spanish, where they pronounce the ceseo instead of the distinción. Now, of course, when it comes to different categories of pronunciation, there are often class connotations that come with it. The ceseo is usually regarded as a lower tier accent than the distinción, which is that educated standard. The ceseo, it may be used a lot within certain regions, but usually the more powerful elite will try to speak with the distinción. Now we have our third variation of this pronunciation, which is actually the ceseo. The ceseo doesn't make the distinction that distinción makes. In the ceseo, the S, the Z, and the C are all pronounced as theta. So they're pronounced with that th sound. And words that have S's in them, such as casa, become caza. The word mesa becomes mesa. And words like corazón and plaza remain the same. So the ceseo is regarded to be below the ceseo when it comes to social classes regarding these manners of speaking. The ceseo is seen as someone who's not as educated, working class, or rural. Now, before we move to talking about Latin America, we're going to talk about one other distinction between Latin America and Spain. This one is the use of vosotros versus the use of ustedes. Usted and ustedes are used in Spain in very formal situations. My grandmother, she's Spanish, she uses vosotros when addressing you all. She never uses ustedes unless it's an extremely formal situation. In Latin America, on the other hand, we use ustedes. In Mexico, most of Latin America, ustedes to mean you all. And ustedes is the main conflict between these two different ways of saying you all is the difference in conjugation. Conjugating ustedes is the same as the third person plural, ellos and ellas. So vosotros has its own form of conjugation. I'm going to say certain verbs, and I will show the way that there's a variation in the way that they're pronounced. So for ustedes, in the verb to know, saber, ustedes is saben, vosotros is sabéis. For salir, which means to go out, this is the infinitive form. The conjugated form for ustedes is salen. The conjugated form for vosotros is salís. Now, ser, which means to be. In the ustedes conjugated form, it's son. In the vosotros conjugated form, it's sois. Tener, which means to have. In ustedes, it's tienen. In vosotros, it's tenéis. And the last noticeable difference in pronunciation is just that in Spain, S's are often pronounced with the tongue higher up in the mouth, closer to the palate than the S pronounced in Mexico and some other Latin American countries. This causes the S to sound, it almost sounds like an SH, like vamos a ir a buscar. It's something that can be noticed when listening. I've noticed it several times. And it does occur in other Latin American countries, not just in Spain. It occurs in Argentina and some other countries. Of course, in Latin America, there are variations within specific countries in the way that things are pronounced. Just as in Spain, you saw those three categories of pronunciation. So it's somewhat ignorant to say that there's a distinct Mexican accent and a distinct Argentinian accent and a distinct Peruvian accent, because that's not. When people in Latin America compare the use of vos and the use of tú, they will usually refer to that as tuteo versus voseo. Tuteo is the use of tú, while voseo is the use of vos. Tú. Now, in Latin America, when people are talking about the difference between the use of tú and the use of vos, they will usually refer to that as tuteo versus voseo. Voseo is the use of vos, and tuteo is the use of tú. It really depends on where people are speaking. In Spain, tú is usually used, but we're talking right now about Latin America. So tú and vos, they have different conjugations. Vos actually has a conjugation somewhat similar to that of vosotros. Countries like Mexico, countries in the Caribbean, and Peru predominantly use tú to mean you. Now this is the you in the second person singular. And vos is used predominantly in Argentina and Central America, such as Nicaragua, but other places such as Guatemala, Panama, Colombia, Venezuela, and Chile use vos and tú interchangeably because there's a coexistence of the tú and the vos. So there are variations in the way that vos and tú are conjugated. For saber, tú would be saying tú sabes. That would be the conjugation of saber in the form of tú. And vos would be vos sabes. In tú, it would be tú sales. In vos, it would be tú salís. In ser, it would be tú eres. And vos sos. Tú tienes for tener. And vos tenés. Tú hablas for hablar. Vos hablas. Now, for me, this is really weird pronouncing it. Like, it feels like you are violating some code of speaking that you've known since the day you were born. So it's awkward, very awkward to change the vowel that you're supposed to emphasize. And these are, of course, in countries where they're used interchangeably. I know individuals who, they usually use tú, but instead of saying, te lo voy a dar a ti, which is the object, they will say vos instead. Lo voy a dar a vos. So that's that interchangeable use that varies. Now, the next phonetic discrepancy between different nations in Latin America and in Spain is the aspirated S. Now, some of you may be asking, what in the world is an aspirated S? And an aspirated S is when the S is pronounced as a h. You're aspirating, you're releasing your breath, and it sounds like a h instead of a s. Now, this occurs in what it says here as the definition is, in phonetics, aspiration is the strong burst of breath that accompanies either the release or, in the case of pre-aspiration, the closure of some obstruents. In Spain, there are regions where there is aspiration and there are regions without aspiration. In northern and eastern Spain, there is almost virtually no aspiration, but in central and southern Spain, there generally is a certain amount of aspiration of the S. It may be hard to conceptualize what I'm talking about now, but don't worry, I will give examples demonstrating the differences and the variations. So Mexico is just super well known for having a very strong consonant pronunciation, very even syllables, giving each syllable a certain equal length to the way it's said. And Spanish, for many people, is probably the easiest, Mexican Spanish is the easiest form of Spanish to understand just because of the way that verbs are pronounced so clearly. Just because of the way that the words are said clearly and all the consonants are stated, which in other countries that doesn't happen. And someone who's listening and hasn't ever experienced that different pronunciation or different accent will be like, hold on, isn't there supposed to be an S there? Maybe he's not saying the word that I think he's talking about. And that can lead to confusion. Now, the aspiration of the S in Mexico is not completely gone. This supports my statement that in countries in Latin American countries, in all of the Hispanic countries, there are geographic and regional variations that occur. Coastal regions such as Veracruz and Guerrero and Oaxaca tend to have an aspirated S, an S that is either aspirated or lost. Now, the lost S is very common in Caribbean Spanish. And what I mean by that is that the S is omitted when spoken. In this case, a word such as tú sabes would become tú sabe. No longer is it aspirated, it's just not at all acknowledged or stated. Okay, so a lot of people that I know think that individuals who live in the Caribbean have a much faster rate of speaking than in Mexico and other countries in the mainland, the main continent of the Americas. And the truth is yes, there's a certain aspect of the way that they speak that allows for them to speak at a faster rate. And the truth is that in countries such as the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, and Cuba, the S will be often dropped and omitted. And in this case, that's one less consonant that you have to pronounce. Think about that. Of course, that's going to allow you to speak a lot faster, just as English speakers use contractions such as I won't, I don't, I didn't. That allows you to speak a lot faster than if you said I will not, I did not, I do not. It allows you to speak faster. And in that case, an individual who learned Spanish in a classroom, didn't learn about the omission of certain consonants, will be like, oh my God, I can't understand anything he's saying. So I'm going to provide examples of the non-aspirated the aspirated and the omitted S so that you can see the difference in the way that they sound. My first verb is gustar, which means to like. So to say, in Mexico, where it's most often not aspirated, the S, say me gusta. That would be the way to say it, me gusta. Now an aspirated S would be me gusta, me gusta. And now an omitted S would be me gusta, me gusta. So I'll go through it again. Non-aspirated is me gusta, aspirated is me gusta, and a omitted S would be me gusta. Another example, if I were to say non-aspirated mis palomas, then an aspirated one would be mis palomas, and an omitted one would be mi paloma. Now, just because an S is aspirated doesn't necessarily mean that an individual will speak faster. Say in Colombia, there's certain accents that are known for speaking a little slower. And those accents they often have an aspirated S. So an aspirated S is not an indicator of how fast you speak necessarily. Now, another thing to know about Colombia is that Colombia has the greatest dialectical diversity of any Hispanic nation, with Spain coming second. Now, aspiration and omission of the S is not unique and native to Spanish. Another language and region that uses it a lot is in Brazilian Portuguese. Not all Brazilian Brazilian Portuguese dialects will aspirate the S, just like not all Spanish dialects or Latin American Hispanic dialects will omit the S. But in Brazil, there are certain examples that I could use, like I am, yo soy. In Portuguese, Brazilian Portuguese would be eu estou. Now, eu estou would become eu tô. Notice how the S was omitted. Another one would be ele está. Ele está. He is. Ele está, which would become ele tá. Now, in Hispanic countries that have the aspirated S, there tends to be a certain linguistic feature that doesn't happen very often in Mexico and some other countries or regions with less aspirated S's. And this is that in parts of Central America, the Caribbean, and South America, and even tiny parts of Mexico, the N's at the end of a word are pronounced nasally. Now, this is something that is very similar to in Portuguese, because in Portuguese, the M and the N are pronounced nasally. I'm going to provide some examples of this, because this can be very confusing, as most people don't perceive this to be the case, but I actually observed this several times with individuals who are Central American, Caribbean. I've noticed this, and I did some further research, and I found that actually it is a case, and it's been demonstrated in several linguistic studies. The word bread, which is pan. Another way that people say it could be pan, pan, quiero mi pan. And that last pan is nasal. Another one, corazón. Corazón is not nasal. Then you say corazón, corazón. Now, this doesn't happen everywhere, of course, but it's been shown linguistically in charts that in certain regions this does occur. And I've heard it myself. Now, saben is another example where saber, when you conjugate it to saben, in non-nasal places, regions, they'd say saben, but in more nasal areas, it would be saben, saben. So this linguistic aspect, it's not big, it's more obscure, but I wanted to talk about it because I've noticed it, I've always thought about it, and I actually felt really happy that there was research online that I could find that reaffirmed my own experiences. So now we're going to go to something that's actually a lot bigger, and it's not as nuanced as that whole nasal thing that I was talking about. This is the topic of yeísmo. The concept of yeísmo is something that a lot of non-native speakers that I've talked to at my school really don't understand and have trouble with. Yeísmo is It refers to the manner in which the double L and the Y are pronounced in Castilian Spanish. There are several variations to the yeísmo. One of them is the palatal lateral approximant. Now, I know all of this linguistic jargon means nothing to the majority of you, but it's basically pronounced by touching the tongue to the roof of your mouth. Now, unless you speak Portuguese, you're not familiar with the LH sound, but it's similar somewhat to the LH in Portuguese, where it's ya ya. In Portuguese, it's ya ya, but in Spanish, it's not as much. And this palatal lateral approximant, represented by an upside down Y, it is probably the most common in Latin America, where it's ya 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 ya. Now, the next variation is pronounced like the English sh. Shh. I'm not going to give you the official name because this one you're familiar with, this phoneme you're familiar with. Now this one's primarily in the Rio Platense regions, the Rio Platense accents, which is in Uruguay and Argentina. And here, primarily, the Y and the double L is pronounced as a sh. And this is, of course, in certain regions. Not all of Argentina, not all of Uruguay, but it's the sh sound. Now the next one, post-alveolar fricative voiced. Basically, it's like the sh, but it's voiced. So it's zh. And this is the same sound as the S in the word measure. This occurs still Rio Platense, mostly in Argentina and Uruguay, where it's yo. While the other one is yo me llamo. This one would be yo me llamo. Now, the next one, the fourth variation, is the j, like a J or a G in English. Now, this one occurs often in Latin America too, as well as in Mexico, where it's j, like in saying yo me llamo, yo me llamo. And the last one is just like a Y in English. This one's not very common, and a lot of the times it makes foreign speakers sound more foreign because it's not really used very often in Spanish, but it's like the word yellow in English. Yo me llamo. Yes, it occurs, but it's not as common as like the number one example I gave you, where it's yo me llamo. It's not all the way to a yo me llamo. It's not a yo me llamo, it's a yo me llamo. And it's also not a yo me llamo. Can you hear the difference? Now, our next linguistic trend that we're going to be talking about is the R. In Spanish, the double R, the R at the beginning of words, and the R before consonants tends to be pronounced as a trill. R, r. Now, on the other hand, if it is in the middle of a word, it's a single R, or at the end of words. At the end of words, it could be a trill, or it could be the other option, which is the tap or the flap, which is pero. Double R would be like corren, but the single R would, in the word for, but like, oh, but he told me this. Pero. Pero is with the single tap. Now, undoubtedly, this is used throughout almost all of Latin America. However, there is a variation that is used in some Caribbean countries like Puerto Rico, sometimes in other countries like the Dominican Republic, but primarily in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico, where they pronounce the R's that occur at the end of words and before consonants closely to an L instead of that trill. They'll say, instead of comer or comer, they will say comel. Comel. Instead of carne, they would say carne. Instead of pasear, they would say paseal. Instead of hacer, they'd say hacer. Instead of caer, they'd say caer. Now, even within Puerto Rico, or as some Puerto Ricans would say, Puerto Rico, This is not something that every single Puerto Riqueño will use. It's something that I'd say it's an easier option to pronounce, allow you to speak faster when you pronounce it as a noun, like ¿por qué quiere que hagamos esto? Or ¿por qué quiere que hagamos esto? Where you don't aspirate and you pronounce the R's like L's. It may allow you to speak faster because the consonants that you're pronouncing are easier just to say. However, not every single person is going to speak like this, and individuals in business and higher levels of education don't tend to pronounce it with that L sound. Now we're going to go to our final topic of discussion, which is external influences. Just as any language that is new to a certain region, there will be external influences that will impact the way things are said. One of the big ones, which I'll start with, is Mexico. In Mexico, as we all know, the Nahuatl, the language spoken by the Aztecs, or the Mexica, as they called themselves, the Mexica, they spoke Nahuatl, and they are, of course, they're the indigenous people, and their words greatly mixed into the Spanish vocabulary of the Mexican people. Now, this should be expected, as Mexico is the largest mixed-race country in the world. So you can expect the language to carry in at least some Nahuatl. And some examples. Atole, which is something that it's a very popular pre-Hispanic drink. It's said in Nahuatl it was atoli. So it's a word that comes from Nahuatl. Another one, tomato, which in Mexico we actually say jitomate. I've always been raised that the way it's said is jitomate, and the majority of people say that. And that is also a word of origin that is from Nahuatl. Another one, aguacate, comes from the word aguacatl, and that's for an avocado. When I'm saying Nahuatl, or words in Nahuatl, I'm not at all... Now, when I'm saying Nahuatl in these words in Nahuatl, I'm telling you, my pronunciation is terrible. I think the closest thing to pronouncing that TL, the TL at the end of the words would be, it's Nawak, something like that, Nawak. But I'm just not the best at doing it. I've done a little bit of research, but I'm telling you, I'm not even anything close to fluent. Countries with larger populations of individuals who are descendant of African slaves tend to have vocabulary with roots coming from Africa. One example would be guineo. Guineo is a word that's used in Caribbean countries, some Caribbean countries, and in the some parts of the Dominican Republic to mean banana. This word isn't plátano, like we say in Mexico, or banana in some other regions of Latin America. The word guineo actually has the etymology originating in West Africa from Guinea. And if you recall, Guinea is actually a country that speaks Spanish, Equatorial Guinea. Now, a greeting that is very common in Cuba, that's quite well known, is the greeting of acere. It's when you refer to somebody as un acere. It's like a homie, a companion, a buddy. And this is actually, this is used mostly by Afro-Cubans, and it comes from the Efik language of Nigeria. A common greeting between people would be que bola sere. Now, que bola is actually from the Igbo language of eastern Nigeria. So these words they originate from Nigeria, and it derives from an Igbo greeting given in the morning, which is Ibola. The literal meaning of bola is have you woken, but it can be used in another way as good morning or good day. Argentina is very well known for their intonation. They're special. It almost sounds as if they're singing. And the reason for such a distinct, different form of intonation when they speak it's very like joyful sounding, cheerful, is largely due to the extremely large amount of Italian immigrants that came to Argentina. Studies have shown that the pronunciation and intonation in Argentina are actually most similar to certain regions of Argentina, like Buenos Aires, is most similar to that of Neapolitan dialects in around Naples in Italy. So Italians began arriving in Argentina in larger numbers around 1857 all the way to 1940, totaling around 45% of the entire post-colonial immigrant population. This is more than any other country. That is it just shows that these immigrants, which is an external factor in most languages, and they impact the way that people speak certain vocabulary. Other than the intonation, we can see there are certain words that are actually, they originate from Italian, that are used in Argentina. One of them is parlar, which actually comes from the Italian word parlare, similar to the French word parler. Another one, manjar, or manchar, because of the sheismo, manchar, which is to eat, or also to know. And it comes from the Italian word mangiare. Mangiare means to eat as well. Another one, mina. Mina is used in Argentina to refer to a female, and it comes from the Italian word for female, which is femina. So now we're going to finish off with Equatorial Guinea, which is the only African nation with Spanish as an official language. Now, Spanish is usually taught as a second language. The official languages of Equatorial Guinea are French, Portuguese, and Spanish, all languages that I actually speak. So I've always thought that that's kind of interesting. Now, in the Spanish spoken there, they tend to use the ceceo, I've heard, or the distinción. And there are some regions that also use the ceceo. But there are heavy African influences on the way the Spanish is spoken, as well as heavy French influences on Spanish pronunciation. One of the French influences is the use of the uvular trill, which is the way that R's are pronounced in French. And this is used often in the Spanish pronunciation as a r. A word such as recordar will become recordar. So that actually concludes our episode. I hope you really enjoyed this episode. I know that for some people, they're not as interested in linguistics as I am, but I really think that they're fascinating. Just like we have various different forms of pronunciation and vocabulary in English, even within the United States, we have certain dialects of English, such as Ebonics or African American Vernacular English and Chicano English, and Northeastern, Bostonian, New York accent. There are just so many things in the English language that are fascinating when it comes to pronunciation, that I also think that it's important that we look at and acknowledge the beauty of the diversity, the dialectical diversity of the Spanish language as well. Thank you very much.
Voy a cantar esta canción con mucho cariño de mi corazón a la República Dominicana, la casa del merengue y la casa de la bachata. Voy a cantar esta canción con mucho cariño de mi corazón a la República Dominicana, la casa del merengue y la casa de la bachata. La casa del merengue, la y la casa de la bachata.